From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you. Here's what's coming up. K-State's Cassandra Olds will talk about the discontinuation of a particular insecticidal ear tag for cattle and what options are available to you producers who either are currently holding supplies of that ear tag type or are looking for alternative tag products. She'll also get into some standard recommendations on tag management. Then K-State's Megan Rolf and graduate researcher Drew Lakamp will discuss his recent study which linked certain key genetic traits of beef cow herds to natural resources use. And on this week's edition of Milk Lines, K-State's Mike Brouk will pick up on that topic of summer fly control for the dairy herd. All that right here on Agriculture Today. You are tuned in to Agriculture Today. Thanks for listening once more. Well, in recent weeks, we've been talking up preparation for turning cattle out on grass for the summer grazing season. And one important component of that is taking steps to protect your herds from those summer fly infestations. One of the key weapons there being insecticidal ear tags. Well, a recent action has taken place that you producers should be well aware of. A certain insecticidal ear tag chemistry has been removed from the market. And to fill us in on that development and talk about fly tag management in general, Cassandra Olds with us, veterinary entomologist with K-State Research and Extension. Cassandra, this news that the chemical chlorpyrifos would no longer be available for use by cattle producers in those ear tags. Tell us more, if you would, about what's happened here.
Yeah, sure. Well, so this was announced by the FDA about a couple of months ago, and it comes into effect after the 28th of February. So there's this compound called chlorpyrifos, and it's an organophosphate. And most people will have used it if they use the Vitex Warrior ear tags. And so it's important to know that we're not here just talking about cattle. So food tolerances have been revoked completely for this product. So its predominant use is in the spraying of agricultural crops. So producers who might have a mixed sort of production system, take a look at your bottles that you use for crops too, because chlorpyrifos can't be used on anything destined for human consumption. It was as an ear tag. And so now what we have is we have a 1-year mandatory withdrawal period if you use it. So they're not saying that you can't use it. However, if you do use it, you have to wait 1 year after you've removed those tags before animals are eligible for slaughter. So it's really important to keep good dates if you're tagging. And so Vitex has actually gone and removed this product from their production, so they won't be producing it anymore. And so farmers who do use this product and who have used it in the past and like it, what they can do is switch it out for the Vitex Max 40. That's their equivalent tag that is in that range. So it's an organophosphate tag. Very similar to the Warrior ear tag, except that the Warrior ear tag was a combination of 2 different organophosphates. And so they just took that second one and bumped up the concentration a little bit. But you could use any other organophosphate in your rotation. And so that's what we're sitting at with that. So we're just recommending that you just stop using them because, unless you're running a cow-calf situation, and this is an important thing, even if you are running a cow-calf operation, if you tag the dams, it counts as tagging the calves too, because the calves are coming into contact with that insecticide from the dams. And so you cannot actually offer those animals up for slaughter within a year of removing the mom's ear tag. So that's really, really important to note. Even if you're not tagging these younger animals, just their proximity to the older animals, which could be tagged, is important. So, there's plenty of other products on the market that you can use for safety. Discontinue using anything with chlorpyrifos in it, and you can see that on the ingredients list. It will be listed there under ingredients, chlorpyrifos.
Again, very stringent restrictions here. And if one does have the chlorpyrifos-based ear tag on hand, They can use it, but they have to be awfully strategic about it, and that brings in the limitations here.
Yeah, if you know that you're keeping these animals for a year after you take the tags out. So if you think about the fact that you're using the tag for about 3 months, so it's a year after you take that tag out. So if you're 100% sure that you've got these animals for at least a year and a half, then you're okay. But bearing in mind that Whitex isn't going to be producing this tag anymore. So you could use tags that you still have, but you won't be able to buy them any longer. And so if you do have them, it's probably just worth getting rid of them, just disposing of them safely according to the box instructions, and just starting with an alternative organophosphate product.
And in as far as efficacy of the substitute products, those other organophosphate compounds will get the job done by and large in an equal fashion?
They should in an equal fashion if you don't have resistance to an organophosphate. And this is why we really stress having good tag rotation. And so what you want to do is it's going to be an annual rotation over a 3-year period. So year 1, you can use one of them. Year 2, you use the second one. And year 3, you use the third one. It doesn't matter which one you start with, but each season you're using a new tag. So now we're going into spring. This would be year 1. You could use a pyrethroid. Next year, going into spring, year 2, use an organophosphate. Year 3, you're going to use a macrocyclic lactone. And so there are ear tags with all 3 of these ingredients in them. One growing season, one type of tag. And so this is really important when you go and you're going to buy your tags. It's not the product name that is important. It's the actual active ingredient. So you've got to look on your ingredient list and look for that active chemical and whether that chemical is an organophosphate, pyrethroid, or macrocyclic lactone. So you're going to have a 3-year rotation before you go back to your original. So that's really important to slow down the spread of resistance. Now, if you find that you do have, let's say, year 1, you use pyrethroids, you had great fly control. Year 2, you're using organophosphates and you're seeing that they're not working at all. Don't forge ahead with the organophosphates. What you then have is a case of resistance. So what you want to do is make sure you don't use an organophosphate for 2 years. Then you would do a macrocyclic lactone, another pyrethroid, and then try again with your organophosphate because, if you've got resistance, it's just throwing good money after bad at that point. But a few things people can do to really slow that down. Most important is good rotation. So know which year you're using what. Make sure you're using the right tag. So look at that ingredient list. Make sure that your tags are stored properly before you put them in. Very, very important is stop using them after 90 days. I know on the box it says 4 to 5 months, but numerous studies have been done that show that you actually only get about 90 to 100 days out of a tag. So if you leave the ear tags in, what you're doing is you're allowing the insects to get a sublethal dose of the insecticide, and that's a really, really fast way to develop resistance. So when the box says 4 to 5 months, don't believe the box. After 90 days, pull your tag out and either replace it or no tags, depending on what your animals are destined for. If you've got stock animals, then you just want to be pulling them off pasture pretty soon. Mm-hmm. Another thing to keep in mind is that you want to tag both sides of the animal. So the way the tags work is that they transfer the chemical from that ear tag, that plastic ear tag, to the fur of the animal, and then it's spread through the oils. So if you're only tagging one ear, you're actually only covering half the animal with the pesticide. So it's always good to tag both ears of the animal. And then we don't always, especially if we're looking at horn fly control, you don't necessarily have to tag younger animals, because they'll get it from the mother. And then also bulls with their big fat necks, they can't really move their heads well enough to get the product off the ear tag. So if you're running a bull with a herd of cows, then you're actually quite fine. He'll bump up against the ladies and get enough ear tag from that. And this is good information whether you use an ear tag or a pour-on. And that's the other thing. People sometimes will put an ear tag in and a pour-on. That's completely fine. You can do that. Just make sure that your products are matching up so that your pour-on and your ear tag in year 1 are both pyrethroids. Because you don't want to have an organophosphate pour-on and a pyrethroid tag, because then you're using 2 products at the same time, which just spreads the resistance. So make sure that year 1, no matter how you apply it, it's the pyrethroid, and then year 2, organophosphate year 3 macrocyclic lactone.
Does that also go, Cassandra, for such things as dusters in as far as being consistent with the chemistry?
Yes. And so you want to swap them out. So if you really like dusters, go and look and see what your options are for dusters, and don't use the same chemical compound indefinitely, because it's just not going to, you're eventually going to get to the point where they don't work. And bad news is when we test the flies that we have in Kansas, they're among the most resistant that we have in the United States. So we really, really do have a problem. This isn't an option of, oh, yeah, well, it would be nice if I could rotate out my products. No, you actually have to rotate out your products. We don't have anything new coming onto the market, so we really have to make sure that we use what we have the best way we possibly can.
Is there anything else that a producer can do to get ahead of flies as cattle are turned out on grass? Sanitation's important, but that's not manageable in most grazing circumstances.
Well, we can get ahead of it a little bit, even in grazing situations. So the best thing you can do is get rid of that first generation, because it stalls them a little bit. So if we're looking at horn flies, pasture burning will burn off all those pupa that are in just hiding out in those old paths that have dried out. That's a fantastic thing you can do. And stable flies are an easier one to manage through sanitation. So a lot of us have had cattle and we've had these big hay bales out for the winter. Getting that tidied up, scoop it away, burn it, do whatever you can to just get it, even if you're just spreading it out so that it dries, then you can really, really cut down, especially on that first generation.
Well, Cassandra, thank you for going over this with us and reminding us of what's happened with chlorpyrifos-based products and what producers need to do to adjust their fly tag programs accordingly. We always appreciate your time.
Wonderful being here. Thank you so much.
She is a veterinary entomologist, K-State Research and Extension, Cassandra Olds, on this part of Agriculture Today, and we'll be back shortly on the K-State Radio Network. Agriculture Today continues now, and we're going to pass along some interesting research information out of the Animal Sciences and Industry Department here at K-State. It looked at the genetics of beef cattle and making a link to the use of resources by those cattle, the environmental footprint, if you will, associated with those genetics. Joining us is beef geneticist Megan Rolf and one of her former now graduate students here at K-State, Drew Lakamp. Megan, it's entitled The Evaluation of Differing Genetic Potentials on Beef Cattle Resource Use in the Great Plains. Would you tighten down, if you will, the objective of that study for us here?
Absolutely. One of the things that we wanted to really look at was resource use in the form of water use and land use in the beef industry, because we know that when we change things like mature size or milk production, we can change things like the amount of water required to produce milk, for example, or the amount of feed that an animal will consume, which of course affects both land and water use. So this study really set up a simulation to look at the impact of those changes when we sort of don't restrict for land use and we make those changes in genetics to see what that does to land and water use.
Drew did the heavy lifting here, so we're going to have him fill in the particulars on this study then with those goals in mind. But this is rather challenging to measure these connections, isn't it, Drew?
Yeah, it certainly is. What we did was really take a simulation that was made by former doctoral student Dustin Ahern with the BCI at K-State. He made a computer simulation that modeled how much input 100 head of cattle would need. And then you could change the parameters of how heavy they were, what was their average milk, things like that. And then the simulation, the beauty of it is the simulation changed as those parameters changed.
And again, the genetic traits, the mature size and milk production, and the milk production side of it was selected here for an express reason.
Right. So when we talk about high milk, we're talking about 25 pounds of milk at peak lactation. And then low milk is about 17 pounds, 18 pounds of milk at peak lactation. What we call high and low are not extremes in any way.
But they would still show the consumptive habits of the cow herd in this case.
Right. So we're trying to get them different enough that we can see trends, but still have realistic values.
Then you cross-reference those milk production levels, high or low, with the genetic potential as far as mature size. What, 3 levels here, large, moderate, and small, is that correct?
Right. What we decided to do was alter what large, medium, and small in different environments actually were. So generally speaking, as you go north towards the Dakotas, the average cow is heavier. And as you head south and west, so like West Texas and basically a desert, the average cow is a lot smaller. So I think our heaviest cow was about 1,700, and then our lighter ones were closer to 1,100 pounds. So we did large, moderate, and small with respect to where they were in the Great Plains.
But then you coupled those values with various impacts on the land, if you will. Cropland, water consumption, methane emissions were part of this too, right? Very
much so. So what we really wanted to look at was the big 3 in the environmental resource space, which is land use, water use, and methane output. Land use went into pasture land, and it went into cropland for feed. And then water use was broken down into drinking water and irrigation water. And then methane, of course, was just methane from the animals.
Let's get right to what you found, and there are so many combinations here, Drew, that are possible. But when you looked at, again, animal size, and when you looked at their milk output, and then you looked at those other variables as far as land impacts, what did you discover?
What we really found was a couple interesting things and a couple things that just make logical sense. In general, when it comes to grazing land, larger animals need more grazing land. And that makes sense because of how we allocate pasture land is just by animal units. Generally, heavier animals need more pasture land. So we had 74 regions across the Great Plains, which the Natural Resource Conservation Service helped us determine, to get all of the different types of forage that were in each of these areas. So the NRCS gave us the type of grasses that were there and relatively how much forage does that produce in a year, and what quality is it over the course of the grazing season. And so that really determined some differences between areas. So for example, the Flint Hills, the stocking rate there is about 7 to 8, depending on how you want to categorize acres per cow-calf pair. But if you go into West Texas, it's closer to like 35. So the differences in land are vastly different, but we can see trends across genetic potentials. What we found was interesting when we talk about cropland, it really breaks down into milk potential. High milking animals need more cropland than lower milking animals, because the simulation determines, based on milk yield and mature size, how much nutrition that animal needs to maintain a body condition score of 5. And then it calculates, based on body size, how much forage that animal can actually eat. So that was about 2.7% of its body weight per day. And then it takes into account the quality of forage in that area. And it says, if the animal can eat enough energy in a day to maintain a body condition score for 5, then the simulation doesn't need to supplement. However, when you get animals that have a high milk yield, their energy demands start to increase, but their body size restricts how much forage they can eat. So they're not meeting their nutrition just with forage alone. So we really need to start bringing in supplement. And that starts to drive how much cropland these animals need. So just to recap, generally what we see is higher milk potential means more crops are needed. And within milk potential, of course, it goes down to body size. So large animals with a high milk yield require the most, and then moderate with high milk yield and small with high milk yield and so on. So that was something interesting. And it confused us for a little while, to be honest, because we go, these are small animals. Right. Why are they eating so much crop? Until we realized, oh, right, they're not getting their daily intake from forage.
What about the water impact then, Drew?
Right. Great question. unsurprisingly, irrigation water was by far the most important, the bigger part of the total water resource. In West Texas, for example, drinking water only accounted for about 25% of total water, compared to like eastern North Dakota, where drinking water was only about 5% of the total water use. Bringing it back to the genetic side, the more crops that this animal needs, the larger that water footprint for that type of animal.
Makes perfect sense. The methane output, where does that factor in?
Right. So the methane output was actually the simplest piece, to be honest, because the international standard for animals that eat more than 75% forage, 7% of the gross energy that they eat is released as methane. And then it's just a simple conversion factor of how much energy is in the amount of forage that they ate, multiply that by 7%, and then convert that to kilograms of methane. And so the more that animal ate, the more methane it produced, and that would just really be by body weight. So the larger animals produce the most, the smaller animals produce the least.
Megan, bring you back in to lend your observations on what this research is saying and how it might tie in to genetic selection moving forward.
Sure. So I think one of the key things that we saw is that there are a lot of regional differences. So any producer selection goals are likely going to be very individualized. And I think that sort of fits with how we generally talk about genetic selection. So I think that was good to see. So I don't think we set out to make any sort of broad recommendations, but rather look at the impact of these different traits and how they can influence resource use. I think it would be interesting to see what would happen in a similar simulation where we had a defined amount of land available and looked at instead with these different categorizations, how many animals we could house on that land with the resources that we had available and the amount of output in terms of weaning weight that we would get.
The write-up on this research can be found in the Cattleman's Day Research Reports out of K-State. There's also an abbreviated article on it in a recent Beef Tips newsletter out of K-State dated February the 21st. Again, the study looking at differing genetic potentials of beef cattle and the influence on their resource use in the Great Plains. Megan, thanks for covering the basics, and Drew, thanks for digging into the details of this, and appreciate your work in grinding through a lot of data to make these results happen.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you.
Along with us, beef geneticist, K-State, Megan Rolf, and one of her former graduate students who's now working on his doctorate degree at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, Drew Lakamp. We'll be back with more. You're listening to Agriculture Today. To close out this Tuesday edition of Agriculture Today, the weekly segment for you dairy producers called Milk Lines. And this week, K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk is nudging you producers in the direction of planning your summer insect pest control. And you well know the main offender there. Mike?
Today I'd like to visit with our Kansas dairy farmers concerning the upcoming fly season. With warmer temperatures, we will start seeing flies around our dairies very soon. Maybe you've actually noticed a few around your dairy already. They seem to come anytime the temperature starts to nudge above 70 degrees, and that is already occurring. So, my question is, are you ready? We know they'll multiply very quickly, and we'll get busy with field work and other things, so if we haven't really thought this out ahead of time, they're going to probably be in an explosive state before we actually take action. We really need to take action now. For those of you that utilize a larvicide in your feed, I hope you're already feeding that. Probably should have already had that into the diets at least a month or so ago, maybe longer in the southern part of the state. For those of you that rely on sprays and baits and other types of control, I hope you're getting ready to do that. I hope you have your supplies laid in. With the supply situation that we have and shipping and those sorts of things, you probably need to think ahead about this and make sure you have at least part of the summer supply ready ahead of time and actually delivered to your farm. If you're going to be using knockdown sprays, keep in mind that those are most effective between 65 and 90 degrees Fahrenheit. Most of the premise sprays that we use, we should probably use those during the warmest part of the day to get the most effective control. How much is this worth to your dairy farm? Well, one of the things you need to remember is that biting flies, like stable flies, and those are the ones we deal with usually earliest in the season, can lower milk production by 15 to 30%. So they may have a significant negative impact on your dairy farm. You know the drill. You'll start to see cows bunching. You'll see them stamping their feet. They'll be switching their tails. That's usually because the stable flies have reached a point at which they're an economic detriment to your dairy. So how many flies does it take on a cow until it's time to do something about it? Well, some of the research would suggest that as few as 50 flies per animal would be the set point at which we need to be taking action. Hopefully maybe before that, but once you reach that stage, you're probably already losing more money than what it would cost to take action against them. Some things you might want to consider is it does usually take a combination of things. So you'll need residual premise sprays. You'll probably need some knockdown sprays to kill the flies immediately. And then you also need to think about areas where flies tend to congregate. This is probably one of the most effective things you can actually do. Areas where you notice flies congregating, such as around trash or maybe in the calf feeding area, baits are very, very effective. And there are many different types out there that you can utilize. They're easy to hang up. Some people will actually use fly strips or fly tape to actually catch them. However, baits in those areas are also very effective. So a combination of things needs to be done on your dairy to control flies this season. I encourage you to begin thinking now. If you haven't already ordered some of those supplies in, you probably need to do that here very quickly so that you're ready when you start to see flies congregate on your dairy. This is Mike Brouk with K-State Research and Extension.
Thanks, Mike, as always. And before we go, we've a brief moment here to mention that Mike's Extension Dairy Specialist colleague here at K-State, Victor Leon Gomez, was a recent guest on the podcast Dr. J's Beef, hosted by K-State's Jamie Lynn Farney. They had a discussion about the increase in the number of dairy operations utilizing beef semen in their production systems, and that's a quite informative listen. We'd encourage you dairy producers to check that out. It's as easy as searching for the podcast Dr. J's Beef. And that is our time for today. Thanks for tuning in. Eric Atkinson for Agriculture Today. This is the K-State Radio Network.